Fabulous. So you should be able to see my slide here. So I will kick off without further ado. I know we have quite a tight timeline today. So just wanted to mention a little bit about what we're going to be running through in today's session, and then I'll do kind of more of a full intro about who I am and who CultureAmp are. But really today's session, given the kind of uncertainty that we're all facing at the moment, one of the only real certain aspects that we can hang everything on at the moment is that we can guarantee there's going to be more uncertainty as we move forward. So I'm going to be talking about how we can collect and act on culture data during uncertain times. I will be talking a little bit about change that we plan, as well as change that is inflicted upon us, such as a pandemic as we're experiencing at the moment. Before I do that, I just wanted to briefly introduce myself. I'm Jess Brannigan. This is a picture of myself, how I like to start my presentations. So I'm based out of our London office. I'm basically a business psychologist. So I moved over to the dark side to work in HR some time ago, having worked in commercial roles. And then I specialized in occupational psychology because I love the topic so much. More recently, I've been working with Deloitte in leadership consulting, and then at Oxford University, helping MBA students think about their talent and how they can pitch that best to clients. But now I get to work with CultureAmp, helping some of the world's best organizations make the world of work better. I'm one of a number of people scientists at CultureAmp because we have a really strong philosophy of marrying together organizational psychology research with applied experience to the technology that we build. Now, just on an admin point of view, I know it's really tricky on a webinar to interrupt, like you don't feel like you can interrupt me while I'm mid-flow and talking. But if you do have questions, pop them in the chat, because my colleague Elwar, who is responsible for the DACH region actually, and is due to be moving to Berlin shortly later this year, he'll be monitoring the chat and he'll be answering them where he can or calling them out to me if it's better for us to have a discussion about the question. So do feel free to pop them in there, and I will come to the end to allow time for questions at the end. So hopefully that works for everyone. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about CultureAmp today and our platform and things like that, but just to give you a bit of context as to who we are, I will just spend a couple of moments explaining that and really where all of this kind of employee feedback piece comes in. CultureAmp as an organization is a people and culture platform. We started back in 2011. We're headquartered in Melbourne, Australia, but we have offices in London, New York, and San Francisco, as well as Australia. And we were really established by our founders because they believe that putting culture first is beneficial, not only for employees and individuals, but for the organizations that they serve. So we were brought into being because we believe that putting culture first can be a real differentiator for organizations. Through engaged employees, an organization can have satisfied customers and ultimately stronger business outcomes. And for us, and our research evidences this, culture is really a lead indicator on what a business can expect later down the line. So we help organizations to make the world of work better. And we do that by making it really, really easy to collect, understand, and act on employee feedback. We offer a full range of culture and people data insights, from surveys around engagement, for example, change and events that might happen in your organization, through to employee lifecycle data, so onboarding and exit, for example, as well as the kind of more developmental side of things, so team effectiveness, 180s and 360s, for example. And that's complemented by a performance module where we help organizations enable feedback in the flow of work, as well as more formal performance development and measurement type processes. As I said, I won't be touching that much on our platform or kind of how those things work today, because I am mostly talking about change and the psychology of that and why you should seek employee feedback. If you want to know more about the platform or you want to talk about some of those more technical aspects, do feel free to reach out to my colleague Elwar at the end of today's session. I will have his contact details listed at the end. So I was going to launch a quick poll to get us started. So I believe I will need to stop sharing for the time being, but you should see a poll coming up shortly.
I can actually start it if you want.
Oh, that would be awesome. Thank you so much.
So let me quickly check.
I wanted to understand whether you or your organization currently collects employee feedback, And by that, I mean engagement surveys, onboarding or exit surveys, or whether you collect data around well-being or inclusion, for example.
You should all see the survey now. I don't know if that works, but I see that it's.
I might have to stop sharing in order to make that possible. I can't see it at the moment.
Let's start it again.
I started again. Wait a second. So now I started it again.
Awesome. And then we see the second question there as well. So are you collecting feedback from your employees on your organizational response to COVID-19? Great, so we've got lots of organizations who are collecting employee feedback already. Yeah, and I included the sort of option because lots of organizations are collecting this information, but maybe not in a kind of formalized manner. So it may not be in a kind of pure data collection form. It might be in a more qualitative format at the moment. Great, and so we've got some organizations collecting data in relation to the COVID-19 response, some kind of thinking about it or getting started, and others not as yet. That's really helpful. So thank you for sharing that information with me. It gives me just a bit of context as we're going through today about how much I should be explaining or unpacking, or how much relevance this has to what you're planning to do in your organization at the moment.
I'll stop it again then, yeah?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much. Paul won't go away. Paul will not go away, I'm afraid. Let me just close that. Great. So it's always great to say you work for a tech company and then you can't work PowerPoint. So bear with me for a moment. So let me get on to our topic for today. Change for our clients, and likely your organizations now, is ubiquitous, taking the form of restructures, office moves, changes in leadership or strategy, massive growth, maybe shifting from things like waterfall to agile product methodologies, or going through a merger or acquisition. Those are lots of the kind of planned changes that organizations are kind of making happen for themselves. Or, as we're experiencing now, fundamental external change affecting us all in the form of a pandemic. I've listed just some of those types of change, but of course there are sort of so many different types of change that we're usually going through. And if you've experienced or been a part of those types of organizational change that have been driven by the organization in the past, or certainly now looking at the type of change we're dealing with here, actually, when we're in the middle of those types of change, it's not always the times where we put culture first, if we're being honest. Other matters often feel more pressing or important. But paradoxically, we shouldn't shortchange ourselves if we let those high standards drop in terms of focusing on culture. So why don't we collect employee feedback, and what do we stand to lose? Let's think for a moment about this rather uninvited change that we're all experiencing in the form of COVID-19. We see lots of organizations struggle in putting people and culture first, and that's because change is really daunting and difficult and quite painful. And somehow it seems to absorb all of our mental energy into kind of a much more blinkered line of sight. However, it does offer some opportunity for us to test out the true values of our organization, as this quote, I think, nicely supports. I found this in a Harvard Business Review article that was posted last week by David Kramer. And he goes on to say that a great many large companies talk about having a social purpose and a set of values, or about how much they care for their employees and other stakeholders. And now is for the time for them to really live up to that commitment. He links in my mind this point that we've talked a little bit about, that putting people first during change can be challenging, but that those organizations who do, especially during the coronavirus pandemic, will reap the rewards later. But it isn't always easy, and we know that. He goes on to give some examples in the article from the past. So when a US drugstore chain, CVS, chose to go more deeply into healthcare, it decided that it couldn't support tobacco products anymore. So it gave up $2 billion in revenue. And he also gives an example from his own social impact organization. During the recession, they made a decision not to lay people off, but instead to reduce salaries on a sliding scale, and that decision is something that people have still been talking about over time. So this kind of people and culture first philosophy, how can we carry this through even during difficult times so that we can still stand up for what we believe in as an organization? So we know that putting people and culture first through change can be really difficult. Let's look instead at some research into a more planned, yet notoriously tricky change that many organizations face: mergers and acquisitions. An estimated 70% of organizational change efforts fail to achieve their goals, and that's a statistic that has stayed consistent since the 1970s. And whilst changes are usually well planned in terms of strategic and operational aspects, much of these poor results have come to be attributed to the poor planning and implementation of the people and cultural aspects of change. And yet, McKinsey and Company note that when people are truly invested in change, it is 30% more likely to stick. And research focusing on M&A specifically tells us that communication becomes particularly important when mitigating resistance to change, because if employees do not understand the change effort or feel the change will hurt their outcomes, they may try to balance the equation by resisting or sabotaging the effort. I've worked on some sort of large outsourcing deals, and this sabotaging the effort can become worryingly apparent if people are not bought into the change. I really like this quote by Larson and colleagues because it sums up the issue with the current status quo. Businesses have gotten pretty good at understanding the business strategy and integration aspects of an M&A, but it's this human side that can make or break whether this huge business investment is successful or not. But before we delve a little deeper into some of this organizational reticence to engage deeply with change, I just wanted to share an analogy. If something yet important, unforeseen, but having momentous impact on your personal life occurred, would you stay quiet on it until it was over and you had all the answers? Or would you figure out a position, start sharing what your thinking was, and invite ideas or feedback from others? Whether you think of a great thing that could be happening to you, for example, a new job offer somewhere in a far-flung destination, or something less positive, for example, like a job loss, most of us wouldn't just stay quiet and communicate on the eve of that event happening, or at the time it happens, or even worse, after the time it happens. We'd need to engage in a dialogue with maybe family and friends or whomever else may be impacted by that, and share our thoughts or ideas, possibly adjusting what things we can. And also looking at how we spend our time and take actions accordingly. But for some reason, our most basic understanding of people seems to get diluted at the organizational level. The organizational scale-up equivalent of having these one-to-one conversations to be able to understand the feelings of your employees, for example, in relation to a proposed or enforced change such as the pandemic, is to ask them for their feedback. Yet some of our clients, even those who have established a sophistication and maturity around requesting feedback from employees through a regular cadence of engagement surveys, for example, often call these processes to an abrupt halt in the face of change events. We're not going to survey this year because X change is taking place, and we know that the results will be impacted, is a refrain that can often be heard. Now, this seems to run counter to the research and our fundamental understanding of the way that humans work. In reality, it's not usually that communication is forgotten about in totality, though. A noticeable pattern that we see emerging is more a narrow interpretation of what communication means by organizations. So much time and effort is put into the case for change and the background to the vision, or the response in the case of unplanned uncertainty or change. But far less is asked around how those who are impacted by the change actually feel about it. But in its proper meaning, communication is two-way, setting out what we want to communicate, but it's also about listening. Therefore, many of us can be guilty during times of change or uncertainty of only focusing on the speaking portion of communication and wholly neglecting the listening part of the equation. In the words of our CEO, Didier Elzinga, failing to close the loop in your communication by listening to employee feedback is highly likely to compromise the success of your change implementation program. So this leads me on to a question. If we accept that true communication is a key tenet of successful change, what is it which prevents us or gets in the way of us or organizations collecting two-way feedback during change, asking our employees how they feel and then taking action and communicating on that. Whilst there's likely a multitude of reasons, I'm going to talk to 3 classic blockers that I have identified most often. So the first is really just having a means of quickly and accurately collating this feedback with sufficient speed and in real time. And that's where a platform like CultureAmp can be advantageous, but it doesn't have to be. Anything where you can collect data quickly and move to action is really important. And so we have actually created some materials, some questions around COVID-19 if you haven't started surveying your employees yet. We've made those freely available, so you don't have to be a CultureAmp customer in order to kind of make use of that. I'll be sharing more on those resources at the end of today. I won't labour this point other than to say it's really important just to be able to robustly collect information and then move on to the action-taking portion of the equation rather than spending a lot of time in the collection and analysis stage. The second reason why organisations sometimes don't do this, or why they don't do it adequately, myself and my fellow people science colleagues have noticed a pattern which emerges, which is often not noticeable when we look at the data and engagement surveys of organisations. So an organisation will be perhaps going through some type of change, and when we cut the data to look at engagement at different management levels of the organisation, we can see a difference in the engagement of different levels of seniority. So senior leadership are responding most favourably across the board, particularly when we look at questions such as the leaders at my company keep people informed about what is happening, or the leaders at my company demonstrate that people are important to the company's success. And when we start to discuss and unpack this, often the senior leadership and team will feel that they have been thinking carefully about messaging around the change and sharing this. But when you dig underneath it, what they are often communicating is the business rationale and the corporate strategy, when those receiving the message want to know what the impact will be on them, how it will feel. They want to hear the story, not just an explanation of the business and financial stats. And this is even more true in a change that happens extrinsic to the organisation. They want to know, what will it mean for me, and how is the organisation pivoting to help us, the people, and not just man-marking the financials? So how can we know if the communications that we're putting out there are landing with the audience? By asking them. If you survey through change, or through an emergency for that matter, you can hear what employees are actually hearing rather than just what we intended them to hear, what they're feeling and what they are saying they need more of, and we can then respond accordingly. After all, none of us really know what it's like for others in very different circumstances during this change. And as much as we try and put ourselves in others' shoes, the best way of knowing how our people actually interpret our messages is by asking them what they really heard. And thirdly, and this is often the biggie, organisations are reluctant to ask or resign to the situation. If we want to make an organisational change or respond as best we might during a pandemic, then why would we be reluctant to hear feedback? It doesn't feel like it makes sense. I liken this to the old proverb, speak no evil, hear no evil, see no evil. Organisations are often very adept, as I've mentioned on the first part, what they speak, but they tend to be very adept at positioning their communications. So to speak no evil, as it were. However, there are things, if we're honest, we're less keen to hear and certainly less keen to see. Having its roots in individual psychology, we're often reluctant to face reality, or on the other hand, resign to an outcome that we feel we cannot control or influence, and therefore become a little bit disinterested in digging into the issue further. Just going to explain those in a little bit more detail. Reluctance could be considered similar to the classic human reaction when faced with threat. We perceive something which could potentially be damaging to us, and the reaction is fight or flight. In this instance, flight. Reluctance in relation to gaining employee feedback during change, or indeed any time of uncertainty, often centres around a wish to avoid scores declining because of a change that we've initiated, or hearing some bad news. And these people are usually correct, that there will be lower results in unstable situations. At the moment, no matter how well an organisation is responding, it's unlikely to be the peak of their engagement in the middle of a crisis. However, without baseline data during a transition, the business will be totally unable to show improvement or to take remedial actions. Moreover, we should keep in mind that measuring employee sentiment is not really about trying to score an A+. It's actually about learning and growth, the kind of continuous improvement philosophy that Carol Dweck espouses in Growth Mindset. And the other portion that I referred to, resignation, this could be perceived to stem from something more similar to learned helplessness. And learned helplessness is a state where individuals believe they cannot control or influence a situation and therefore give up on trying. But if we possess the belief that we can't influence how people feel about the change, then we may as well not find out how they feel because they won't be able to act on this information anyway. But that's a mistake. Because the key thing to note here is that our organizational behavior may be being influenced by the same types of thinking errors that hijack our individual emotions, influencing our behavior and our willingness to seek out employee feedback at the very times that we need it most. However, not asking for feedback and not taking action on it does not mean that the issues are not there. Culture is always there. It is a living, breathing concept which exists whether we pay attention to it or not. And if we continue this line of thinking, then we can reframe our reluctance and resignation. For example, one of the questions we include in our standard engagement surveys and change templates is, the leaders at my company demonstrate that people are important to the company's success. And if we think about asking for employee feedback from another perspective, we can see the fact that you are asking them how they feel and the nature of the questions that you ask in and of themselves could yield significant strides that would help us come up with better, strong responses to that question over time, because it shows and it demonstrates what you are actually striving for as an organization. Asking the right question of your employees now is so key because it sends a very clear message about what you value and what you think is important. And really, it's about valuing them. So how can we help this people geek community, as we call them, those people who are interested in building and culture and strong cultures in their organizations? How can we help them do what we advocate for? How can we help you guys get feedback from your employees during the COVID-19 pandemic? At CultureAmp, our team of people scientists have created an emergency response survey in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have made this available to customers and non-customers alike. See the resources at the end of this presentation if you'd like to see more on this. And also you can reach out to my colleague Elwar, who can give you more links and more content. Its design was informed by research, so the collective intelligence of the CultureAmp people geek community, which is rather extensive now, and our analyses of customer needs throughout the evolving circumstances. The questions themselves are very short, so we take a pulse format. It takes under 4 minutes to complete the survey for employees, and we utilize our standard 1 to 5 strongly disagree to strongly agree rating scale. Those who are using it in platform have statistical analyses that helps to guide the prioritization of actions through statistical driver analysis. But those who aren't are also able to see the scores and take action just as quickly. And we have lots of free guidance material on how to interpret that data. I've just been looking at some of our sort of aggregated data back from a number of clients. And one of the most consistent themes that's coming out as a strong driver of confidence in an organization's response at this time, all center around leadership, how visible leadership are, how well they're communicating, and whether they feel they're putting people first. Those are kind of the key drivers that we're seeing in terms of the things that we would expect. You should ask about these things because they matter the most to employees at the moment. So we don't dictate, but rather guide design based on best evidence and research available, but we highly recommend customization depending on the circumstances of your own organization. So your location, for example, the business size, resources, stage of the response in terms of how far along you are in terms of the organizational response to COVID. But to give you a flavor of some of the design and research behind this, we have actually looked at unexpected emergencies because they look at sort of unprecedented and unique circumstances. There are substantial bodies of research that help us to determine what feedback is crucial to collect, understand, and act on during times of emergency and rapid change. And we have lots of articles on our academy, which again I'll link to, which talk more about some of the research that we're drawing on. But essentially we have a longer diagnostic which delves much deeper into some of the emergency response pieces. Here are some scenarios for guidance to help you look at how, instead of dropping an employee feedback strategy, you might want to evolve it to deliver the insights that you need for the right time and for the right cost now. So some organizations are still thinking about it. And if they're not sure, that they're worried about maybe asking too many questions or having more of a draw on employees' time. So one thing we'd say is if you don't want to ask more questions, you could consider just going out with one open-ended question to start a dialogue or a conversation, just to kind of see how well the organization has responded and what employees would suggest that you do moving forward. For those wanting to collect more regular feedback, they might want to run a pulse, which they repeat weekly or fortnightly. And I can give you an example of what we've done here at CultureAmp. So at CultureAmp, we ran a pulse survey initially just focused on the working from home requirements. Since we had to transition to the whole organization being based from home, we wanted to understand very quickly, right at the beginning, how have people adapted to this? Do they have everything they need? Before we then start looking at some of the deeper components. So this was followed the following week by an emergency response pulse, where we looked into some of those factors I mentioned around leadership and communications and so forth. After taking that data, our leadership then looked at this and communicated on what they were hearing and the actions they were taking as a result. So we've seen some pivots in terms of the types and forums of communication that we're receiving based on the data that we've collected back from our own employees. One overarching thing that I really want to impress upon today is it comes back to what we at CultureAmp call the role that myself and my fellow colleagues do, which is people science. This is quite deliberate because people science is a science. You're meant to experiment based on data and evidence. And that's what taking action off the back of employee feedback is. It's really an experiment looking to try and shape improvement over time. In so many other areas of business, we're allowed to experiment in product development or A/B testing, and we need to allow for that in people and culture. Our response needs to be a little bit more willing to try things out in the face of uncertainty, review the information and the data we get back before pivoting and amending and measuring again. And that way we learn and we can demonstrate humility by doing so. So my final call to action, the questions that I would like you to ask yourself in relation to your organization or to yourself, perhaps, are we closing the loop in how you communicate through change and uncertainty? Do you have a means of collecting short, sharp employee feedback with speed? Thirdly, aside from communicating, do we actually understand and know what our employees are really hearing from us based on those communications that we've given? And fourthly, our three wise monkeys, have we challenged the reticence to ask for employee feedback? And if you've asked yourself these four questions, I'd like you to start thinking about when should we get started in surveying or getting feedback from our employees now. It doesn't have to just be about surveying. There are other ways of getting this type of feedback. So I'd really encourage you to think about what ways you could get information back from your employees. So I did mention we have some resources available. So we have templates, a short pulse for COVID-19 and a longer, more deep dive survey on an emergency response. You can find those together with lots more material on building resilience through difficult times at culturefirst.com/resilience. We also have another couple of forums that you might find helpful. So People Geek Answers is a website where you can post your questions if you have difficult questions you're struggling with in relation to people and culture at the moment. We have a wider range of people geeks, as we call them, posting their questions and answering. So you're kind of crowdsourcing ideas from others who are in the industry. And also we have online our academy, and this is where we post useful information. So guidance and articles on how you can implement some of the best practices that I've been talking about today. And if you want to know more, you can reach out to my colleague here, Elwar, and his email address is shown here. They are sharing PDF copies of the presentation afterwards if you don't have quite enough time just to copy that or write that down right now. But that is my opportunity to pause my monologue and see if there's any questions so far. I think Elwar's been answering some.
Jess, first of all, thank you very much from our side to really move us to this different, these different responses that you're thinking about at CultureAmp and that you're doing. I haven't seen loads of questions yet. Only one shout out and a thank you that you included all the sources, which I guess coming from a scientific background, that's great that you
Yeah, well, we like to do that because we like to base our ideas on the research and the psychology, but it doesn't mean that we can take credit for it. We're just really pulling from existing data and the best practice research that's out there. So I like to kind of share where I've drawn that from, because often people are interested in the original sources. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I mean, we aren't the biggest group, so actually, people, if you guys have questions, you can just start you can unmute yourself and put your video on if you'd like, and just ask a question.
Is anyone actually surveying through Change and found any interesting data, or having any questions come to mind?
Yeah, would also be my interest. Like, is there anyone out there who already uses surveying data at the moment?
We've certainly seen a lot of our clients, to start with, they were kind of wondering about it and thinking about it. And then we saw kind of more of the early adopters kind of go out with asking questions and not waiting. One of the things we find is people are like, oh, I'm not sure what questions to ask or what's appropriate. And so that's why we came up with the templates. But really, our kind of push to clients is it's better to kind of reach out to employees and start asking. You can always refine the design over time.
How do you guys do that personally now in your company at CultureAmp? Are you changing anything during this crisis in way you communicate with employees?
We're surveying much more often, so we're doing these pulse surveys weekly, and we are changing the topic slightly. So we change up the questions from week to week based on what's happening. So based on 1 week's pulse, we have taken action in terms of the way that we're communicating. So that we're asking more questions to follow up on that and see if has that worked in terms of the sort of amends that we did. I see someone asked a question about whether we share our research, and we do. So we share on our CultureAmp website. We have a blog, and that's where you can find lots of our kind of published research. So one of the things that I know lots of people find interesting is our link between engagement and ROI. So the link between engagement and other kind of financial stats with listed companies. So that's an interesting one to check out. And you can find that on our blog, and we're continuously kind of updating that with relevant materials at the moment.
And so if someone is in this chat right now and they want to start doing that, they want to start with, surveying their employees, or basically just in receiving feedback, what would be your next step? What could you do if you just want to start?
Yeah, if you don't have a platform, then I would suggest you go to culturefirst.com, and that's where you can download our questions. So you'll have a set of questions that you can review, and then you can just put them anywhere that you like, anywhere that you have available to you. So you don't need to be a CultureAmp customer in order to use those questions. And we've got like the questions and some guidance about how you might do that. So yeah, we go to culturefirst.com and check out those resources and kind of get going to see what you can do to try and help your employees right now.
Got it. And if you want to say, at what size of a company would you recommend using more than just a normal, Google form or something like that, but move more into something more complex and more tech savvy like CultureAmp? Like, what would be the...
Yeah, I mean, it does vary. I think obviously the larger the organization, the more complex it gets collecting data and making useful insights from it. However, that being said, we do work with lots of very small organizations during normal times. But I think if that's the thing that's going to get in the way of you surveying, I would rather you just survey than sort of advocating for CultureAmp, because I think we really truly believe that you can help your employees by understanding how they feel right now. But in the future, when you're looking at kind of opportunities, generally, if you're doing more than one survey type and you're going out to, say, more than 50 people, it's much easier to collect insightful data that's kind of pre-analyzed for you. So we do lots of kind of statistical manipulation of the data to kind of help you zone in on the things that are going to make the most difference for your organization based on your own employees' responses. So it just makes that really simple. But that's kind of not a priority right now. We're kind of more focused on like, how can we help you just ask the right questions of your employees? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a customer or that you need to be to kind of get going on that.
Yeah. I mean, one question that always comes up in the German world, obviously, is the one around data security.
Yeah.
You have a take on that you want to share with us? Like, how do you make sure, data is used correctly in these times, especially?
Sure, yeah. So we're fully compliant with all the data legislation, as you can imagine, and we do actually host our data within Europe for that reason. We've been doing quite a lot of expansion within the European region. So the DAC region is really kind of hot for us right now, and so that's why my colleague is Elwar is moving out to Berlin shortly. So yeah, that's something that we take care of. Elwar, I don't know if you have any points that you would want to raise there.
Yeah.
Go.
I'm happy to expand on this very quickly, but we have all the enterprise kind of security measures in place, and we work with some of the tightest security or tightest companies when it comes to security, like N26, GAT24, Lilium, and stuff. And so all these organizations expect the high standards, which we have.
Nice. And maybe one more question, just from a general point of view. When I look at larger organizations and more traditional organizations in Germany, most of them, they have this typical employee survey that they do either once a year or every 2 years. And I always try to, obviously encourage them to a more instant way of gathering feedback. What would you say, is it good to also connect both, or to basically use both a CultureAmp type of methodology and an employee survey methodology? Or what is your take on these different, basically ways on how you can gather feedback?
So we actually talk about, so you'll hear quite a lot in the industry about people talking about continuous listening. So we should continuously listen to our employees. And we think that's a nice sentiment, but sometimes that can be then taken and kind of clunkily executed. So it ends up being just kind of continuously spamming people with surveys all the time. So we talk instead about a deliberate listening strategy, which is more about touching employees at the moments that matter during their life cycle with you. So it might be about connecting the onboarding data you collect when people join your organization. Then you run perhaps an engagement survey once or twice a year. And then you also have exit surveys, maybe kind of manager 180s and 360s. So we're getting multiple sources of data insight that we can bring together to help understand actually, why are people joining our organization? What are we delivering on when they're here? And then when they leave, why are they leaving? And do we see some connections between that within the cycle? So kind of trying to join it all together as much as possible can be really beneficial. And we're seeing more and more work happen, particularly about joining or connecting the dots between employee kind of culture data like engagement, and how does that relate to our high performers or our low performers, and does that show what we would expect, and if not, why not? So those kind of connections can be really interesting.
So basically your take would be to rather collecting data to existing touch points, basically like onboarding or anything else, instead of connecting it to this is the next survey that you're taking and the next survey that you're taking, just for the sake of taking the survey, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. So we collect it kind of organically wherever we can get it. Yes, there is some survey frequencies that are helpful, but it doesn't need to just be a continuous survey that goes out to everyone in order for us to collect insightful data for the organization.
Cool. All right. Let me have a look. Is there any more questions? Anything that you guys really want to know?
No.
Yeah.
As I say, so I think we are sharing the presentation decks afterwards, if I'm correct. So my details are on there, and my colleague Elwar's details are on there if you want to know more, either about the immediacy of kind of surveying during COVID times and like a copy of the resources and things like that, because I do have that slide there so you can see the websites. Or if you want to have a broader conversation about employee feedback, then Elwar's the man to have that conversation with you.
Yeah, cool. And then Eloy, when are you going to be in Berlin? Like what's your status at the moment?
That's a great question. I was meant to move next weekend full time. Given the COVID situation, this is being pushed back a little, but I expect to be in Berlin as soon as the situation is resolved, to better support our customers and help newer German companies that are looking to start with CultureAmp.
Oh, sure. Awesome. Well, then again, also for, those in the chat now who are coming from Germany, now you have a face to your potential contact in the future, which is great. So thank you both so much for your insights and for sharing what we can do in this crisis and also beyond. If you guys want to go back to the main session, I'm just gonna put the link in here. We're gonna start back in the next 4 minutes, so you might bump into the other kitchen session that's still going on, but I guess that's fine. That's the same way it would work in the normal conference as well. So just rebuilding the same kind of like ingenuity moments. And yeah, again, thank you so much. I wish you the best, Jess, in London, that everything goes well there. And hope to see you soon. And for the rest, you can click on the link and then we see each other again in the main room.
Thanks for the opportunity, and I'm really lovely to speak to you all today. And yeah, likewise, stay safe, stay happy.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.